It's showtime! Again, Beetlejuice rises from the grave, but does the ghost with the most have what it takes to spook and delight a new generation? That and more on today's episode of The Real Review, so stay tuned. Welcome to The Real Review, where you get some of the latest happenings, real thoughts, and real perspectives in the world of film and television. Let's get right into our review. The synopsis for this film is: after a family tragedy, 3 generations of the Dietz family return home to Winter River. But still haunted by Beetlejuice, Lydia's life is turned upside down when her teenage daughter Astrid accidentally opens the portal to the afterlife. Once again, returning to the director's chair for this follow-up is Tim Burton. It stars a number of different actors, including Michael Keaton as Beetlejuice, Winona Ryder as Lydia Dietz, Catherine O'Hara as Delia Dietz, Jenna Ortega as Astrid Dietz, Justin Theroux as Rory, Willem Dafoe as Wolf Jackson, Monica Bellucci as Dolores, Arthur Conti as Jeremy, and Santiago Cabrera as Richard, as well as a number of other people that I did not have time to mention. There are also a number of characters from the original that did not return, which I think is to be expected of a sequel, as well as a film that is being released so far away from its original in 1988. Characters who are not returning include Glenn Shadix, who played Delia's eccentric home designer in the last film, who unfortunately passed away in 2010. We also have Jeffrey Jones, who has mostly stayed out of the limelight due to some significant legal trouble that he was involved in a number of years in the past. And although Jeffrey Jones is not in the film, his character does have a role that is portrayed within the film that is a follow-up from the original. I won't spoil that in this review, but just be aware that he, as the actor, did not reprise his role for this film. And perhaps most well recognized and significant in not returning are the actors Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin, who played Barbara and Adam Maitland in the original film. There is an explanation given for why they did not return, but you should be aware going into it that they are not actually in the film. All that being said, I think that the original Beetlejuice film was a very significant cultural event. I think that the original Beetlejuice has become in many ways a very iconic piece of American cinema. It's one of those films that Tim Burton did so well in that era that kind of toed the line between horror and comedy. It's not for all ages. It's definitely a film that I think children, especially very young children, might find very disturbing. But it was a film that there was a lot of humor, there was a lot of fun parts about, and always managed to, in a sense, soften the edges of the darkness and sort of the horror that was kind of built into the film. Again, that was something that I think Tim Burton did very well in that era. In doing a lot of research about the original Beetlejuice film, I found it very interesting to find out that the original film was written and inspired by films like Poltergeist and Gremlins, and you can really see that and feel that in the way that the original film played out. There was a lot of times where it was horrific, but it always managed to pull you back in with the comedy and keep things grounded in a more family-friendly style horror, if I put it in those terms. All that being said, it really did become iconic for many people in American cinema. It's one of Michael Keaton's probably most well-recognized roles and has gone on to be a beloved Halloween classic as well as just kind of an all-around classic film. So there was a lot riding on this film going to the theater, and I think for me, who was a big fan of the original, the creativity that went into it, the well-balanced nature of the original film, there was a lot riding on it for me. It's been many, many years, been over roughly 40 years since the original film came out. The original released in 1988. And I think for the most part, this film did a good job of satisfying and scratching the Beetlejuice itch. This one's coming out in 2024. So there's been a large amount of time, and it's given time not just for the concept for this film to develop, but also for the actors to naturally age into things and allow for a more interesting update to this film. We have Winona Ryder, who played Lydia in the original film, who's now much older and can actually play the role of a mother, whereas if a sequel had come out right after the original had been released, they wouldn't have been able to age up Winona Ryder's character, I think, enough to allow for her to have a child. That created a really interesting dynamic within the film of, in a sense, passing the buck off to a younger generation. I think sometimes what happens is stories and films will come out and they'll be trying to cash in on the social bankroll, if you will, and cultural bankroll of the importance of the film, the significance of the film. And so they will rush out a sequel, and because of that, it'll end up being something that's half-baked or doesn't have enough to it to really warrant a good follow-up. So I think, thankfully, because nearly, like I said, 40 years has passed, there's enough there to warrant a sequel and to allow for a new story to be told. I think of something like the sequel to Top Gun. If they had just pumped out another sequel to Top Gun right after it happened, would have just probably been a carbon copy of the original film with, a different enemy. And similarly, Beetlejuice 2 would have probably just been a carbon copy. I actually read originally they were batting around the idea of doing something about a Beetlejuice in Hawaii, but for whatever reason, nothing ever fully materialized until now. Now we have a whole new era of life for the characters within this film. So I think it was interesting. The story in particular was a worthy successor and a worthy follow-up to the original Beetlejuice. It felt like there was enough here to warrant a follow-up. I think some other good strengths to the story in particular, I think the story was funny. It was enjoyable for the most part, and it left me happy to have experienced the film. There was a lot of times where I was laughing or found myself kind of surprised by a different direction that the film was going in, and I had a lot of fun with it. When I left the theater, I felt like, yeah, I'm glad that I went to go see that. That all said, there was some significant issues, I think, for me in the role and themes of this film. I think a big part of the themes, or if you will, the structure of the original Beetlejuice film was that it was really a story about two characters dealing with an unexpected death that they're going through and what that means for them. You had Barbara and Adam in the original film who died unexpectedly, and then they are kind of a fish out of water. They're going through this whole new world of discovering what it means to be dead and how to come to terms with that, as well as how to have a purpose and have a significance outside of what they originally had, a very loving kind of normal life. And so it was very fun. It was very interesting because you kind of got to go along on this journey with Barbara and Adam, the Maitlands, in the original film, and feel like you were experiencing new things with them as they were experiencing them. And I think one of the lacks of this film was there wasn't a huge amount of people in the film that weren't very comfortable or familiar with the afterlife. Most of the characters in this film, and I'm not going to say all and who, but I would say, 90-some% of the characters in this film were very comfortable with the idea of there being an afterlife and very comfortable with a knowledge of Beetlejuice and a knowledge of the dangers of Beetlejuice. And so it kind of removed some of the stakes for me. I think it kind of made it feel like, well, this is stuff that just should be expected because we're already very familiar with the Beetlejuice character and what he's capable of. Now, they did try to present a new bad guy, if you will, a bad girl, if you will, in the role of Monica Bellucci. And I'm not going to spoil exactly what happens in the film, but they did present her as sort of being this sort of new archetype of a bad guy. I feel like her character was very wasted in the film. It felt like her role in the film really was just to be there to try to out-evil Beetlejuice a lot of the time. And it didn't really feel like there was a lot of stakes or a lot of necessity for her to be in the film other than that. It felt like at times she was just kind of popping up here and there to progress the plot along far enough with her character so that way when it finally wrapped her into the main story, she had a reason to be there. Whereas it felt like they were trying to just give the most screen time they could to sort of the mainstay characters, especially Beetlejuice, who played in the original film a very significant role but was on screen for a very short amount of time. I've read that in the original film, he was only on screen for about 17 minutes. In this film, it felt like, and I have to check the actual time, but it felt like he played a much more sizable time on screen and a much more sizable role in the overall plot. And because of that, again, it felt like somewhat a rehash of the same world. One of the things that I was hoping for, and I got somewhat, was a sense of an expansion and a moving into the bigger parts of this afterlife world. And I got that somewhat. There was an appearance of some new types of characters and new settings in this afterlife world, but a lot of it really was just kind of set in, hey, here's this place that you've seen before, and here's this place that we're going to revisit again. Could they have made the film successful without spending time in those places that are so iconic and so well known? No, but again, I feel like I wish they had spent more time developing the story out into the world of the afterlife. It felt like a very small film in a way because, again, they presented a few new things here and there, but they really didn't have a huge impact on the plot overall. They kind of just happened, and then we moved on from them. Again, I did have a very fun time with the film. I laughed a lot. There were times where I was surprised by the film, but nothing about this film really left me feeling like they had fully fleshed out a story, you know? Once again, and I've said this with other critiques of films, there was some kind of minor side plots that were going on, but none of those side plots really had anything to do with the main story for the most part. A lot of it just kind of was setting up things to allow other action to happen with the main story. So I'm doing my best here to not spoil what those overall story elements that they added for this film were, but you add those two elements together, which is fun, enjoyment, a somewhat purposeful story and reason for the story being expanded to a new generation. That combined with feeling like they didn't do a lot of side story, they didn't do a lot of expanding the world too much and creating new interest points within the afterlife world and within even the world of the main characters of the film. So I think when you combine those two things, it left me with an overall satisfied but not amazed type feeling. And for that reason, I gave the overall story for this film an 82, which is a B-. The next topic I would cover has to do with the acting. Overall, the acting in this film was still, once again, very solid. I felt like everybody really nailed their roles. The best of the best on top of everybody, I think, for me, was actually Catherine O'Hara as Delia Dietz. She, in many ways, became the heart of this film, and it was a really interesting thing because in the prior film, you know, she played almost an antagonistic character, somebody that was the cause of a lot of bad things happening, and in this film, she has a very different role, but I felt like her development as a character between the two films was very realistic and very interesting, and she often was a highlight for me whenever she was on screen. Winona Ryder did a really good job as Lydia Dietz as well. I felt like she was very interesting as an older version of Lydia, and it all felt very realistic that would be the progression of her character. I felt like Jenna Ortega did a great job, as well as Michael Keaton. The only thing I would specifically say for Michael Keaton's character is, although he did a very good job of resuming the role of Beetlejuice, there was a bit of a intensity to his overall style that I felt like was somewhat lacking. And I think, you know, obviously he's aged, he's gotten a lot older. Maybe the energy is just not quite there as it once was. There was definitely still moments where it felt like he was over the top and ridiculous, but it almost felt like more of the action was happening around his space. And in the first film, it felt more like if you were anywhere within the general vicinity of Beetlejuice, you were going to have to deal with him. This film felt more like, well, as long as you didn't wind up nearby him, he wasn't going to be the cause of too much mischief or mayhem. And I hope I'm explaining that well. You know, I think his original character was so larger than life and so grand, it's not possible to really top that. And again, it's not like he did a bad acting job. I mean, he's still iconic in the role. I guess maybe a better way of saying it is if you took him in this role and you took his energy down from where it was at in the first film, which was like at a 10, this one felt more of like he was at a 7 to an 8. And so he did great. He did good overall, but it also felt a little bit toned down. And, you know, when you think of a demon, a ghost, whatever Beetlejuice actually ends up being, that's doesn't age, you know? So it's a little bit odd in a sense to see him as an older character of Beetlejuice, but he still did a very effective and a very decent job in the role. There were a few characters that I felt like were a bit wasted in this. Monica Bellucci, who played Dolores, she's a tremendously good actress. It just felt a little bit like what really was her character in this film. I couldn't pinpoint anything about her other than angry or spiteful and say that really symbolized her character. You know, she wasn't bad, but it definitely didn't leave me feeling like she was an iconic person that I would want to see her in tons of other content that was out there in this role. Additionally, the characters of Jeremy and Richard in this film, they weren't bad, but again, they just felt a little bit like, they were kind of just there to serve a significant purpose to move the plot along, but they didn't really have a huge impact overall on what I felt like was necessary to the story. I think if they had maybe spent a little bit more time giving a backstory to all three of those characters and really developing that backstory into the film, then maybe they could have had a more significant purpose in it, and maybe it would have felt like they'd done more with the role. It's just the roles felt very simple and very basic. So it was kind of a mixed bag. I think overall I was happy with the acting, but also there was a lot of wasted potential. And so for that reason, I gave overall the acting an 88, which is a B+. Next, and I'm sort of wrapping these categories into one, was the VFX, the cinematography, and the editing. I know that those are very broad categories that can be divided into their own separate things, but I think in this film in particular, they all were important together. I think in some films, cinematography can be the language of the film and can set things apart. And I think sometimes the editing can do that as well as the VFX. And then in other films, they all really need to operate cohesively and as one unit. And I feel like they did a good job of that for this film. Nothing in this film felt out of place when it came to the cinematography or the editing. I will say there was definitely times, and I think some of this had to do probably more with the story itself, but also somewhat with the editing. There were times where things felt a little slow, and they did feel like they were kind of dragging their feet a little bit. There were moments when I'm sitting here where I was like, okay, well, now what? And are we going to do something more? Is there something that needs to be cut to move to a different angle or presented in a different way? And sometimes I felt like that might have had to do with the pacing of the editing. Additionally, with the VFX, there was a lot of times where it felt like they were trying to harken back to the original handmade stop-motion animation that occurred in the original film. And for the most part, I feel like they pulled that off. There was an oddness to it in this film that I can't quite put my finger on, that it felt practical and it felt real, but it also at times felt a little artificial. And I know that sounds ridiculous for something that's obviously designed to look artificial and fake, but it almost at times felt like artificial computerized stop-motion animation. I don't know how to explain it. I thought overall the stop motion effects were done very well and implemented in a very fun way that kind of like was like, oh, that's cool. Again, but it just, at times they felt a little off. Whereas in the first film, they really fit into the overall story. And it felt like it was more of getting you into this otherworldliness, this other place that existed outside of the world that we know of. In this film, again, at times they felt a little off, they felt a little odd. I do appreciate them. I hope that these were actual claymation and stop motion animation effects that they did, and I give them kudos for that, if that's what they attempted to do. If this was some sort of compositing thing where they were mixing a little bit of claymation with VFX and other things like that, then I wouldn't overall be super surprised. So overall, I liked the VFX. Overall, I did think that most of the time, the cinematography as well served the plot, and it did a good job. And there was a couple shots in particular that felt kind of fun and different and really set up some cool reveals and some cool moments in the film where it felt like I was being pulled in versus just being shown a series of images. And so overall, wrapping those things together for the cinematography, the editing, and the VFX, I gave that a score of 84, which was a B. And lastly, one thing I cannot wrap up this review without mentioning is the music. Danny Elfman once again returns as the composer for this film, and I will say overall Danny Elfman did an amazing job with the score. This film felt like a natural extension of the first film's style and the first film's tone, and there was not any huge missteps in that regard. Everything in the film felt fun and interesting. There's always been a real kind of zany and off-the-wall feel to a lot of Danny Elfman's music, and especially in this film, which deals with some really off-the-wall and some really crazy type content, and I felt like this film was no exception. That said, even in the zaniness, there's a bit of a sense of just dark and somber and serious that makes these films have this tone of being both lighthearted and being horror. And I don't think Beetlejuice 1 or Beetlejuice 2 here would have been anywhere near as successful if not for the Danny Elfman scores. They would have been good and interesting, but I think that his scores have elevated these films in a way that has made them iconic to most viewers. You know, when I think of classic Danny Elfman scores, Batman is obviously top of that list. So is The Nightmare Before Christmas. But I think also right up within that and some of the best that he's ever created was the Beetlejuice soundtrack. And I think this one would fit well within the soundtracks. That said, was there a lot of new things? Was there a lot of added elements to the overall film with the music? No. The positive side of that is it's again iconic, fits very well into the film and elevates this film. And it got a lot of points in that regard from me. But because of the sense of this just being not a rehash, but a lot of it was building on the music from the original film. And so I don't feel like I can elevate it to the same level I might as a film that was doing something completely new and completely different. It still did very well in my mind. It really set the tone for this film. For that reason, I gave this film's score and music a 91. So with all these scores in mind, with the story, the editing, cinematography, the acting, the music, when I wrap those all together, where I'm left is I gave Beetlejuice Beetlejuice an 86. Just some final thoughts, I would say, if you are on the fence about checking this out, I would definitely suggest seeing the first Beetlejuice film if you haven't seen that already. This one very much operates within the world of the original film and sets a lot of things up that are going to confuse you at first and are really going to make it a better experience for you if you've experienced the first film. If you are a big fan of the original Beetlejuice film, I think this is a worthy successor. I think it's a great one to go check out and to go enjoy. And I think in some ways, slightly, it leaves it open to maybe a third film. Will they make one? It's hard to say. I think it'll be a bit of a TBD thing. I think it'll depend upon how well this film does and what is the demand out there for a Beetlejuice 3 type film. I do think that with the bringing in of Jenna Ortega's character and sort of her role within the film, as well as Lydia and a couple of the other story elements, they did leave it open to another story and another project that could fit within this world. Without spoiling anything, it's finalized what happens at the end of this film, but there's obviously still ways, I think, in which they could bring out a new story and tie it into, you know, the future of a lot of the people that are still around. I would be interested in potentially checking that out. But again, this was a satisfying enough follow-up for the original Beetlejuice, and I'm glad that they made it overall. If you would like to get connected and learn more about the podcast, I would encourage you to do so. You can check us out at realreviewmedia.com. We've got links to all of our different social sites, as well as this audio or video, depending upon whichever platform you're listening to. You can check out an alternative version of that. Additionally, we'd love to hear your thoughts and your perspectives on Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. Maybe you thought it was horrible. Maybe you thought it was way better. If you'd like to send us your thoughts and give your input, you can shoot us an email at realreviewmedia@gmail.com. Love to hear your thoughts and perspectives, and thank you for checking out the show. And as always, it's been real.